Good morning, everyone. They told me to break a leg backstage, so they wish me luck, actually. Welcome, everyone, today. I will be sitting and partially standing for most of the day, but I'm really happy to be here. We have a really big room of people here today. I understand we're at capacity for the event, so that really shows that the MeeGo community continues to really thrive and grow. In fact, we have many more people here than were at the Dublin event, so it's going nowhere but up. So that's great. Welcome everyone to today's event. You know, this has been a great year for Linux and open source and just everything around the idea of collaborative development, both from a commercial perspective, but more importantly, I think from a community perspective. And as many of you might already know, we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of Linux this year. It's amazing to think that Linux still has 1 year in the United States before it will be able to drink alcohol. But it has certainly done well, and at the Linux Foundation we put together a little video just to give you guys a retrospective on just how far Linux has come in the last 20 years. So let's take a look at that video.
Our story begins 20 years ago. Boris Yeltsin was sworn into office. Jay Leno replaced Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show. And cell phones were really, really big. It was August of 1991, and a 20-year-old computer science student named Linus Torvalds sat down at his computer in Helsinki to post what is now one of the most famous entries in computing history. Hello everybody out there. I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby, won't be anything big and professional like GNU. It probably will never support anything other than AT hard disks, as that's all I have. Well, word of Linux open source project quickly spread around the globe, and developers from all over contributed their code. Linus named his OS kernel Linux, and chose a penguin as its mascot, after a little incident at the zoo. He soon made a very important decision that would shape Linux's future just as much as the technology. He chose the GPL license, created by a visionary named Richard Stallman. The Linux kernel, along with the GPL license and other GNU components, revolutionized the computing industry with a few very simple yet very important freedoms. The freedom to use the software for any purpose. The freedom to change the software to suit your needs. The freedom to share the software with your friends and neighbors. And the freedom to share the changes you make. These radical ideas fueled its spread around the world, and somewhat paradoxically, its rise from a hobbyist experiment to the foundation of a large and thriving commercial ecosystem. Companies built businesses around Linux. In 1999, Red Hat's stock tripled as it became the first Linux company to go public. That same year, IBM spent $1 billion to improve and advertise Linux.
What's he even mean? His name is Linux.
Soon, Linux was knocking out industry heavyweights and fueling the rise of the internet with its free software. In short, Linux revolutionized computing. But whenever something is this disruptive, there's bound to be competitive crossfire. But Linux not only survived, it thrived. Today, the kernel development community numbers in the thousands, with hundreds of companies collaborating on Linux development. Every 3 months, another version of Linux is released. So, where is Linux today? Running in 75% of stock exchanges worldwide, and powering the servers that deliver Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, eBay, and Google. You use Linux literally every time you surf the internet. It's in your phone, in your TV, running 95% of supercomputers, and in many of the devices you use every day. Linux is everywhere, and the Helsinki-based programmer who started it all, he orchestrates this worldwide army of developers from his home office in Portland, Oregon, as a fellow at the Linux Foundation. As we celebrate 20 years of Linux, we can all see ourselves in its story. Thank you for being a part of its first 20 years.
It's really amazing to think just how far Linux has come. And I think that it really is a testimony to the fundamental advantages that collaborative development, whether it's from an industry perspective or a community's perspective, really have. This is a truly superior way to create software and to create products. And you know, I've been working in the Linux community for a long time. And you know, companies come and go, people come and go, and things change, and one year it's this, one year it's that, but the fundamental principles remain the same. And over a period of time, you can just see how large Linux has become, and how projects like MeeGo become these unstoppable forces that no single entity controls, that no single entity dominates, and that really is the benefit of this collaborative development model. So today I thought I would take you through just how fundamental the changes that are going on in the IT industry are, and where open source, and specifically where projects like MeeGo, fit into those changes that are happening. You know, Linux is really dominating so many different forms of computing. It's just worth looking one more time at how important it is to everyone's daily lives. Linux runs things like air traffic control systems, so your life is literally in Linux hands. It runs nuclear submarines, so your death is in Linux hands as well, potentially. It runs things like the CERN Super Collider. It created all of the digital effects in movies like Avatar. It powers the majority of the global equities trading exchanges around the world. We did a study recently that showed that over 72% of the global equities trading platforms that are out there are running Linux, and these are just the ones that report, so we actually think this number is probably low. So it's your life, your death, and your money that are all riding on Linux as well. And Linux, if you look at other markets where it's entered, and this is probably a good analogy for the mobile space where Linux is just at the early stages of entering the game. Looking at supercomputing as one example, in just a decade, Linux has gone from almost no share to now completely dominating that market with over 96% share. It's been a complete reversal, in fact, in terms of the share. Again, because it's a superior development model, a superior way to create technology. It's not only changed in terms of market share, but it's actually changed the fundamental nature in terms of the power of computing. Just if you look at the huge increases in processing power that have been enabled by these exotic Linux architectures, it's really amazing. And that's because people have access to the source code and can really innovate in a cutting-edge way in this particular market. But it's not just supercomputing, it's not just Wall Street servers, it's also in the embedded system space where Linux is really beginning to dominate. And also in the mobile space with things like MeeGo, Android, Google's Chrome OS, things like HP's Web OS. They're all Linux-based and they're all growing fast. I mean, it really isn't a zero-sum game. All of these things are growing incredibly fast as the market expands dramatically, particularly in the mobile device segment. And Wall Street is even betting on Linux. This is a great, and open source, this is a great example of where you can look into the future and see that this is really the preferred development model. Because investors only invest in the future, right? You want your money to grow, you don't want it to stay flat. This is a 10-year chart that shows the price of Red Hat stock versus the price of Microsoft stock. Microsoft has basically stayed flat for a decade, while Red Hat has gone up 400%. So clearly, investors, market share, all of these things are telling us that the world is really turning to open source and turning to Linux. But I think most of you already know this. The better question for all of you is, why are people turning to Linux and open source to create mobile experiences, to power supercomputing facilities, to run the internet, to do all of these terrific things? Well, there are really four main reasons for that. And I thought I'd walk us through those reasons today and then show how MeeGo really is taking advantage of these major shifts in the IT industry and really creating something that is going to be impactful for years and as Linux has for decades to come. And so the first reason why open source is really, really dominating is because the internet itself is changing. You know, the internet today, if you think about it, is, you know, generally an internet of people. There's about 1 billion people on the internet. They say it's heading to 2 billion, maybe even more in the very near future. And that's interesting, and that's really what's defined the internet to today. But the future of the internet is really something very different, where the internet becomes an internet of things and connected devices. And I'm sure you've heard this out in the press, and it's the big buzzword these days, the Internet of Things, but I assure you this is real. That all sorts of things are being connected now to the internet, and almost everything it has an IP address or will have an IP address in the near future. Whether it's cars, appliances, whether it's smart grid technology, things to manage traffic and so on, this trend is really irreversible. So I thought I would show you guys what that really means to the computing infrastructure that's going to power this Internet of Things, and why open source is really suited for it. This is one example of a company in the southwest part of the United States, a small power company that has about 1 million subscribers to their power service. And so a traditional power company in the previous era of computing would go out and manually read meters once a month, producing about 12 million transactions per year. Right? They go out, they read the meter, they bring the information back, they aggregate it, they generate a bill, about 12 million transactions. And if you look at what happens when these companies deploy smart grid technologies, where they put, in most cases, a Linux-based device at the meter that sends information out to the power station servers, you can get, on a daily basis, a massive increase in the number of computing transactions. And so just daily meter reading starts to really increase the requirements for computing power. But where we really are going, where the world is really headed, is a way to intelligently use this information and really translate it into something that can save real energy. And what that means is needing to poll these meters every 15 minutes and translate all of that data into something that can be useful in terms of people managing their power usage at peak times versus non-peak times and so forth. And that goes from 12 million transactions to over 35 billion transactions a year. It's a true sea change in terms of the way computing needs to operate. So if you look at what that future looks like in terms of infrastructure in general, and this is a very simplistic example, it requires a few things. Instrumentation at the meters, so some kind of IP addressable device that can send out information and be polled. It requires network servers to gather and store that data. It requires high-performance computing systems to take that 35 billion transaction set of data and actually analyze it into something that's useful. And then you need wireless devices to display that information anywhere, make sense, interact with it, and make it actionable. And so if you think about it, embedded systems for instrumentation, network servers, storage servers, high-performance computing, and mobile devices, that sounds pretty familiar to most of the markets that Linux is dominating today. And that's a fundamental reason why open source and Linux are very well poised for the future of computing, and why MeeGo as a part of that is a really important part of a much broader trend in technology. Now the second reason I think is something that people intuitively understand, but it actually has a more detailed explanation in terms of why people are turning to projects like MeeGo to open source and Linux. And I think we all know that open source is free. It's free as in cash, it's free as in freedom. But the importance of saving money, in particular to the mobile device industry, cannot be understated. If you look at what's going on in the industry today, you've got this huge proliferation of new devices out there. And when you look at these devices, honestly, they all kind of look the same. And you really can't tell which device is which until you do one thing. Until you turn the power on and look at the software inside. It's really software where most of the value is being created in the mobile device industry today. And that's also where most of the cost is being driven in the mobile industry today. And I hear this from executives all over the world when I talk to device manufacturers, when I talk to people who are in that business. They really say that it's just exponential, and you'll hear from some of these folks today, it's exponential in terms of the number of lines of code and just how much is changing in cost and going up in that industry. And this creates a tremendous amount of price pressure. So my costs are going up because the software is more sophisticated and that's what consumers want. But what's worse is at the same time, on the upper part here, you have a shorter time in the market to actually sell your products, because a phone that I bought 6 months ago or 12 months ago is almost obsolete today. So you have less time to make money and your costs are going up. This is a really, really tough situation for in particular, the mobile device industry. So the solution that the industry has decided to adopt, and is evident by the increase in a massive way of market share of open source platforms in mobile, is to use collaborative development to solve this problem. To jointly develop software in order to save money, and because open source allows you to control your own destiny, you essentially have your own intellectual property because it's licensed in a way that allows you to consume it and use it however you want. What the industry is doing to turn the revenue that they may have missed because of the shortening of the availability of these products in the market into new revenue opportunities with things like applications and services on top of those platforms. And so that is really the crux of why open source is becoming this juggernaut in the mobile device marketplace. The next reason, beyond just that shared innovation and the new value you can create with open source from a financial perspective, is that we're really redefining personal computing. We've really entered a new era where smartphones are really the new desktop. Or maybe it's tablets or netbooks, or maybe it's a web browser, or maybe it's an ebook reader or a digital picture frame, or maybe it's a television set, or maybe it's a car. The point is that the desktop fundamentally has changed in nature, and we've moved from an era where the desktop was primarily decided by one company and where everyone had a similar form factor, to really this proliferation of devices where people are accessing the killer application, which is the internet, from a huge host of devices. And fortunately for us, most of those new devices have one thing in common. Most of them are based on Linux. Whether it's Amazon's Kindle, whether it's a TiVo, whether it's a smart television, whether it's any of the many different kinds of phones out there, whether it's many of the things you'll see today from the MeeGo project, really Linux is what's dominating this new multi-device landscape. And I would go even so far as to say, in the next few years, you're going to see types of devices that none of us have ever thought of yet. And unless your name is Apple, Microsoft, or RIM, the only way you're going to bring those products to market is to use Linux and open source. There really is no other option for you on the table. And that really is a compelling reason for the use of open source and Linux. And the final reason why projects like MeeGo are so important, why Linux and open source are doing so well and poised to do well in the future, is because the future is not going to be defined by hardware and software sales anymore. In fact, I would go so far to say that while we all understand that software is essentially free these days and everyone's using free software to create products and services, that hardware is going to be free in the near to almost immediate future. We're really already seeing this today, where you can get a free laptop with a wireless service plan. If you look at the price trend of the Amazon Kindle, I think they just announced yesterday that ebooks are now outselling all print books on Amazon. And if you look at this price curve, it looks like by November you'll be able to get a Kindle for free. Probably by just buying a bunch of ebooks. The move to services is inevitable because Amazon's not making money off of hardware sales, that they're making money off of selling a service, which is essentially ebooks. And if you look at just how big this opportunity is and just what kind of stakes are in the game here, just look at one example of a service out there today. $150 billion market. Does anybody know what this market might be? Applications sold over app stores?
Hold 4 trillion. Hold on.
So it's in porn? No, it's not. That's actually much bigger.
It is.
This is text messaging. This is text messaging. Isn't that a crazy number? This is just a mind-blowing number. And what you're going to see in a few minutes is that the future of who actually controls these services is at stake. And that's really driving people towards Linux and open source. It's happening in the consumer world where people are making money off of things like search or streaming audio and video, application stores and so forth. This is really where all the cutting edge action is happening. And it's not just happening in consumer devices, it's happening in the enterprise as well. Here in Silicon Valley, I work with startups all the time that don't buy any software or hardware, nothing. They basically use open source software to create their service. They host it on Amazon's cloud or one of the many cloud offerings that are out there, and they don't buy anything. I mean, the hardware guys aren't going to go out of business, don't worry about it. Their customers are just going to be fundamentally different types of consumers, whether it's a big hosting company or whoever. But this move towards services is inevitable. And I want you guys to really concentrate on this because this is why MeeGo is poised to be so successful. Because if we look back in history, Linux is in a very similar position. And if you look at the great services that are out there today, things like Google, things like Facebook, things like Amazon, I mean, ask yourselves, could Google search be what it is today if it was built on top of .NET? I mean, it's just crazy to think about that. That is why open source is such an important part of the future. And so we're really in this sort of perfect place right now for things like MeeGo or things like Linux, because we're at the center of all these major changes, and we have this fundamental aspect in terms of the licensing model, in terms of the community development model, in terms of the pricing, in terms of how people are making money, that's really, really advantageous. So with my last couple minutes here, I want to just emphasize, and I think this is particularly important to MeeGo, is that it's not just the development process, the changing nature of technology, this move towards services. This is about how people make money. And that also is changing. If you look at what the old PC world used to look like, it looked a lot like this. We're basically an operating system vendor, and in the majority of cases it was Microsoft on the desktop, would sell their software to an OEM who would pass that cost onto a consumer would buy a personal computer, and then they would go and buy software from any ISV out there. And ISVs generally got a free ride, right? They were able to get an SDK from any of the OS vendors, whether it was Apple or Microsoft. They'd build their applications and they could sell them to whoever they want, and no one really controlled that access to applications on top of the platform. So it was a pretty simple model, and this worked for a really long time. But that model is becoming much more complicated and fundamentally changing. This is what today's ecosystems look like. What they look like is you have software and platform vendors who are still selling their platforms to device makers, but they're also taking revenue opportunities by creating their own app stores as a platform. And now, operating system vendors and platform providers aren't just letting ISVs write anything they want and provide those to anyone directly. They create gateways through app stores or other things where they control what's on the platform and collect fees for that. And you have this move and insertion of network operators who are now subsidizing devices and essentially giving them away. They're paying the bill for the device makers, the OS vendors, and in exchange, they're using that to sell their data services, voice services, text messaging, as I just gave an example, on through to consumers. So the landscape is changing dramatically, and how money gets passed around is changing dramatically. And it's big stakes, right? $150 billion just for text messaging. And so let's look at two future scenarios. One scenario is where a proprietary software vendor controls that platform, and one scenario is where open source is utilized to build platforms of the future. And I'll just use I'm going to pick on one of the people in this chain here, one of the different participants in this chain, just device makers, to illustrate how different these worlds are. If you're a device maker and you're using proprietary software to create your products and sell those on to consumers, whether it's a network operator who's buying these things and subsidizing them for consumers or directly to consumers themselves, you're pretty much in the same business with proprietary software. You're buying an operating system from someone that they control, you're bundling it onto a machine, you're selling that machine through either to a network operator or a consumer. And you're really confined to a very tough, very tight margin business, and a business that many device makers know well, but it's not a business that I would describe as a big future high margin growth opportunity. Now let's take a look at the option if you use open source, things like MeeGo, to actually address these changes in the market. As a device maker, you're dramatically expanding your opportunities. You own the platform, right? You can create your own app stores. You don't have to pay royalties to anyone for it. You can devise your own services on top of it. You're in a totally new game, and you're in a much better game, a game where you can control your future. And that is the fundamental advantage that projects like MeeGo have. They are going with the stream. They are things that device makers can leverage to create new opportunities rather than just staying in their old businesses. And that really is why MeeGo will be successful over long periods of time, just like Linux has been successful over very long periods of time. So, we're really in the first 5 minutes of a very, very long game with MeeGo. And